December 19th, 1944, near Bastogne, Belgium. The forest was burning, yet buried in snow. The ground shook beneath the thunder of German artillery. Every few seconds, the world flashed white as shells tore open the trees, sending splinters flying like knives. The air smelled of cordite, frozen mud, and diesel smoke. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. American tankers of the 10th Armored Division were caught in the storm. Their M4 Shermans, quick, light, and dangerously thin, rolled across the frozen countryside like tin coffins. Each time an 88mm shell screamed through the air, men held their breath, praying it wouldn't be the one to ignite their fuel tanks. Too often it was. On the southern edge of the front, near a road choked with snow and wreckage, a column of Shermans burned like candles. The men inside never had a chance. It was there that Sergeant Frank Donnelly from Ohio, a mechanic turned tanker, realized something the others didn't. He was knee-deep in snow, his gloved hands black with soot, when he saw it, a wrecked German Tiger lying half-buried in ice. Its turret was ripped open, its crew long gone, but the armor, that thick, glimmering steel, had survived everything thrown at it. Around it lay jagged scraps of metal, some scorched, some clean, all thicker than the Sherman's own hide. To most men, it was wreckage. To Frank, it looked like salvation waiting in the snow. Night fell over Bastogne like a lid on a coffin. The forest went quiet except for distant engines growling in the dark. Frank couldn't sleep. He kept thinking of the Tiger's armor and the men he'd buried that morning, friends who'd trusted the tank's paper skin. If he did nothing, more would burn tomorrow. But what could he do with enemy scrap and a blowtorch? The cold was so sharp it cut through uniforms and memory alike. Frost-covered helmets and rifles like dust in a tomb. Somewhere in the distance, a German tank engine roared, and the echo rolled down the valley. The Americans huddled near their machines, waiting for dawn. Then Frank made his choice. Before we go deeper into this forgotten moment of courage, this is WW2 Frontline Legends, where real history meets the bravery that shaped it. If you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button, give this story a like, and tell us where you're watching from around the world. I read every comment, and your hometown might appear in the next legend we uncover. Under a faint moon, Frank woke his crew and pointed toward the wrecked depot at the edge of the forest. They followed him through the snow, past burned trucks and shattered guns. The wind moaned through broken steel like ghosts whispering in the dark. There, half buried in ash and snowdrifts, lay piles of armor fragments, pieces of Panthers, Tigers, and wrecked half-tracks. Frank's eyes lit up. He ran his hand over the cold steel, feeling the thickness, the weight. The Germans had built their tanks like fortresses. He had spent his life fixing farm machinery in Ohio, welding tractor blades and steel plows. He knew metal when he touched it. And this was stronger than anything the Sherman carried into battle. That night, the men began their desperate work. They tied ropes around chunks of armor, dragging them back through the snow toward their tanks. Each plate weighed more than a man, scraping and clanging across frozen ground. Sparks flew as they fired up their welding torches, muffled under the sound of distant shelling. No one spoke of permission. There was none. Headquarters hadn't ordered this. In fact, if they found out, every man involved could face discipline. But discipline meant nothing to the dead. Out here, survival had its own rulebook. Frank worked until his hands blistered under his gloves. They bolted and welded plates along the hull, over the flanks, even around the turret ring. It was crude and ugly, a Frankenstein creation stitched together from the bones of their enemies. But when he stepped back, steam rising from the hot metal, he saw something powerful, a tank reborn in the image of necessity. At dawn, the horizon glowed with fire again. German artillery resumed its merciless rhythm, shells crashing into the frozen ground. The tankers clambered into their machines, bracing for another day of survival. The modified Sherman rumbled forward, its added armor rattling like chains. On the ridge beyond, a German anti-tank gun locked onto them. The first shell screamed in and struck the Sherman's side. Everyone expected it to punch through, to turn the crew into flame. Instead, the shot ricocheted. It glanced off the welded Tiger plate with a burst of sparks and vanished into the trees. Inside, stunned silence. The crew stared at each other, hardly breathing. Then laughter, wild, nervous, disbelieving laughter. It had worked. They pushed forward, firing back through smoke and snow. The enemy, confused by the Sherman's stubborn resistance, began to retreat. That day, Frank's platoon survived, every man. For the first time in weeks, the 10th Armored Division advanced without leaving burning hulks behind. By nightfall, word spread through the camp like fire. Crews whispered of a Sherman that took a direct hit from a German 88 and lived to tell the tale. Mechanics and welders started visiting Frank's tank, running their fingers over the scorched plates as if touching a miracle. Soon, other crews began scavenging wrecks too. The forest echoed with the hiss of torches and the clang of steel on steel. Within days, a strange transformation swept across the division. Tanks began to look unrecognizable, a patchwork army of scavenged steel. Each one carried scars of its birth. Fragments of enemy armor bolted onto American frames, track links welded to weak spots, hulls plated with what the Germans had left behind. It was improvisation at its finest, or defiance at its worst. To the soldiers, it was genius born of desperation. To the rule-makers far from the front, it would soon look like an act of rebellion. But that reckoning would come later. For now, Frank Donnelly's tank rolled through the snow, its mismatched plates shining like a knight's armor in firelight. His creation was saving lives, even if it might cost him his career. As the sun set over Bastogne, the battlefield fell eerily quiet. Smoke hung low between the trees, glowing orange from distant fires. Frank climbed from the turret and looked back at the path they'd survived, the craters, the wrecks, the frozen silhouettes of machines that hadn't been so lucky. He didn't smile. He only nodded once, as if silently acknowledging the men whose loss had forged this new idea. He didn't know that within a week, his crude invention would spread across entire battalions. He didn't know that the same trash the Germans left behind would save over 1,000 American tankers from the same fate that haunted him. He only knew one thing: tomorrow, they'd have to fight again. And now, maybe, they'd have a fighting chance. But what Frank couldn't see beyond the snow and smoke was that his act of defiance was already drawing attention. From headquarters, from officers who didn't like surprises, from inspectors who believed regulation mattered more than survival. By the time they arrived, the patchwork Shermans were already rolling through the woods like ghosts, unstoppable, unapproved, and unforgettable. And when the army men in polished boots demanded answers, they'd find none, only the echo of a welder's torch and the legend of a man who turned German trash into American salvation. By Christmas Eve 1944, the Ardennes had become a frozen graveyard of steel. The snow, once white, was streaked with soot and oil. The front line pulsed like a living wound, shifting, bleeding, never still. Somewhere amid that chaos, word of the patched Shermans reached command headquarters. And command was not pleased. Orders had been issued months earlier forbidding any structural alterations to government vehicles. Field modifications, they said, endangered mechanical integrity. But out here, mechanical integrity had already been replaced by survival. Frank Donnelly's name began to circulate in whispers. Some called him a hero. Others called him reckless. To his men, he was simply the guy who had given them a chance to see another sunrise. The winter wind cut through the valleys like knives. The armored columns crouched in the snow, waiting for dawn's visibility to bring another round of shellfire. Inside his tank, Frank listened to the slow ticking of the engine cooling down, a heartbeat of metal. His crew had stopped fearing battle. They feared the officers now. Because the better the armor worked, the more attention it drew. At 0900 hours, 2 jeeps arrived at the 10th Armored Division's field position. The men who stepped out were clean, pressed, and angry. They wore clipboards like weapons. The lead inspector demanded to see the unauthorized modifications. His boots sank into the snow as he approached Frank's tank, a hulking monster of welded plates and scorched seams. He circled it once, jaw tightening. The tank looked more like a scrapyard sculpture than a government machine. "Remove every foreign component," he ordered coldly. Effective immediately. The crews stared at him in silence. Their faces were hollow, eyes rimmed with frost and disbelief. Behind them, the forest rumbled again, another barrage incoming. It was as if the war itself was laughing at bureaucracy. When the shells began to fall, the inspector dove for cover beside the very tank he'd condemned. The explosions came closer, pounding the ground with the rhythm of death. Shrapnel hissed through the air, cutting branches like blades. Frank's tank took a direct hit to the hull. The impact shook the earth. But when the smoke cleared, the Sherman still stood, smoking, dented, alive. The inspector blinked, face pale beneath a layer of dust. The enemy gunfire eased. He looked at the tank again, at the black scorch mark where an 88mm shell had failed to penetrate, and said nothing more. By nightfall, No one mentioned the removal order again. Word of that firefight spread like wildfire through the 10th Armored and beyond. Across the Ardennes, tankers began stripping wrecked German Panthers for armor plates, track links, even road wheels. Mechanics joked that the Shermans now looked like metal patchwork quilts. But behind the humor was awe. For the first time, American tankers could face German guns and not feel naked. At the Bastogne perimeter, Captain Roy Daniels of the 3rd Armored watched a formation of these hybrid Shermans roll past. Their sides layered with mismatched steel, their hulls bristling with spare track segments. He whispered to his lieutenant, "They look ugly as sin." The lieutenant replied quietly, "Ugly still breathes." The Army's rulebook had just lost its authority to the battlefield. Night after night, Frank's crew worked under the glow of welding torches. The hiss and crackle of molten metal became the soundtrack of survival. They melted snow to wash their hands, drank coffee from canteens blackened by smoke, and welded until dawn turned the frost to steam. They named their tank Roughneck. It carried pieces from at least 4 destroyed German machines. Each new plate told a story. One salvaged from a Panther near Foy, another ripped from a Tiger abandoned in Wiltz. It was as if the enemy's arrogance had been reforged into American resilience. By the final days of December, the transformation was complete. Dozens of Shermans now bore this bastard armor. They looked monstrous but performed miracles. Reports came in from scattered units, direct hits deflected, crews surviving, counterattacks holding. The brass couldn't ignore it anymore. A major from headquarters arrived unannounced, supposedly to evaluate the situation. Instead, he found a division alive and fighting back with unmatched ferocity. He walked the lines in silence, gloved hands trailing over the cold surfaces of tanks that should have been coffins. He turned to Frank at last and asked, almost softly, "How many men do you think this has saved?" Frank didn't look up from tightening a bolt. "Don't know, sir," he said. "But I buried enough to know it's worth it." The major said nothing else. He left without giving orders. And the next morning, official repair depots began quietly supplying welders with extra fuel. No paperwork, no approval. Just silent acknowledgement that the Frontline had rewritten the rules. The change spread far beyond Bastogne. By early January, the Field Armor Initiative appeared in internal memos disguised as maintenance modifications. The officers who had once condemned it now cited it as evidence of battlefield innovation. The same command that once called it vandalism now praised it as ingenuity. But while reports celebrated the numbers, 1,500 crewmen saved, multiple engagements survived, none could capture the sight of those tanks at dusk. They moved through snow and smoke like armored ghosts, clanging and groaning under their mismatched skins. Each patch of steel caught the light differently, a mosaic of survival under the winter sun. Even the enemy noticed. German observers, watching from distant ridges, began reporting heavily armored Shermans of unknown design. They believed the Americans had developed a new tank overnight. The irony was too rich to measure. The new armor was simply German scrap welded by desperate hands. The winter battles of Wiltz and Foy became testing grounds. The modified Shermans withstood impacts that tore others apart. Crews emerged shaken but alive. One after another, letters went home, short, trembling lines that began with, "I made it." Still, Frank's satisfaction was haunted by doubt. The war was far from over, and every success felt temporary. The Germans were adapting. Their shells grew hotter, their ambushes smarter. And the more effective the modified Shermans became, the more determined the enemy grew to destroy them. In the bitter cold of January 1945, Frank's unit received intelligence of a counterattack forming along the Wiltz Road. It would be their bloodiest engagement yet. The tanks lined up in the pre-dawn mist, exhaust curling into the icy air. Frank sat in his turret, staring at the horizon, the world painted in shades of gray. He thought of the scrap plates welded to his tank. Once enemy steel, now his shield. He wondered if the Germans who had forged it decades earlier ever imagined it would one day protect the men they tried to kill. There was something poetic, almost sacred, about that symmetry. When the first shots came, the earth erupted. Artillery thundered from the ridges, tracer rounds cutting through the fog like red lightning. The patchwork Shermans advanced into the storm. Their engines roared, snow flying from their tracks, guns blazing. For hours the battle raged, a storm of metal and fire. But when it ended, the line still held. Out of dozens of tanks, only a handful were lost. Hundreds of men climbed out of their machines, alive, trembling, staring at the dents and scorch marks that marked the difference between life and death. That night, under a sky heavy with smoke, the men gathered in silence. They didn't cheer. They didn't boast. They simply looked at the tanks that had saved them, ugly, patched, indestructible, and understood that the armor of survival was not made in factories. It was made in desperation, in defiance, in faith. By then, Frank's creation had become more than an experiment. It was a movement. Mechanics in other divisions wrote to Bastogne, asking for instructions. Welders joked about patenting the design. Historians would later call it the most effective field adaptation of the European theater. But to the men who lived it, it was simpler than that. It was a promise. If they could turn the enemy's waste into protection, maybe nothing was impossible anymore. They didn't know it yet, but the idea was spreading even faster than they imagined. Because on the other side of the lines, the Germans were starting to do something eerily similar. And soon, both armies would be fighting inside machines made from each other's ghosts. When the last echoes of battle faded from the Ardennes, the snow-covered valleys were littered with the wrecks of two armies. Between the burned-out trees, men began to count the living. What they found defied every prediction. More than 1,500 American tankers, men who should have died in machines too thin to survive, were still breathing. The patchwork Shermans had held. But the story didn't end there. Intelligence officers studying captured documents stumbled upon a revelation that made even hardened veterans pause. Across the line, German maintenance crews had been scavenging American wrecks, prying off sections of Sherman hulls and welding them onto their own panzers. Each side, desperate to endure, had turned the enemy's ruins into its own protection. The battlefield had become a mirror of iron. In ruined villages like Wiltz and Foy, you could find these strange twins, American tanks wrapped in German steel, German tanks patched with American plate. When snow fell on them, you couldn't tell which army they belonged to. Men whispered that the war had gone mad, that the dead were protecting the living no matter what uniform they wore. Frank Donnelly never saw himself as a legend. To him, it was simple. If a man could weld, he could fight another day. Yet historians would later argue about his name, about whether he was one man or many, a dozen mechanics who shared one idea. Some claimed his tank, Roughneck, was spotted near Bastogne with a German cross welded onto its flank, a silent joke left for the enemy. Others swore the story was invention, a soldier's fable born from snow and fear. But every veteran who lived because of that armor believed he was real. Through January 1945, the modified Shermans kept pushing east. Their hulls bore the scars of 100 near-deaths. Every dent was a signature, every welded seam, a heartbeat. Engineers arriving from supply depots took photographs, sketches, measurements. They wanted to understand how field desperation had achieved what factory design could not. Those drawings would later inspire the layered armor systems that became standard in post-war tanks. The irony was hard to ignore. The official reports called it adaptive innovation, but on the line, men called it something else, the ghost armor. Because each plate carried the memory of an enemy tank that once hunted them. It was as though the war itself was folding back on its own destruction, turning loss into defense. When spring came and the forests thawed, the patchwork Shermans rolled south toward the Rhine. Their engines coughed black smoke, their plates rattled with every mile, but they no longer burned the way they once did. They had become survivors, forged by the very weapons meant to destroy them. In the quiet after victory, warehouses filled with damaged armor were catalogued and melted down. The bureaucrats called it cleanup. But to the crews who watched the torches cut through their welded plates, it felt like erasing history. Those crude seams, those uneven welds, had carried them through hell. Watching them vanish into scrap piles was like burying comrades all over again. Frank Donnelly's records ended in the spring of '45. Some said he went home to Ohio. Others said he stayed in Europe, working on reconstruction projects. No one knows for sure. His name appears once more in a maintenance ledger beside a note. Experimental armor, effective. After that, silence. Decades later, historians revisiting the Battle of the Bulge would uncover fragments of field reports, hand-typed, half-frozen in time, describing the bastard armor initiative. One officer wrote, "This improvised practice has directly increased crew survivability by no less than 50%. Another simply wrote, "It shouldn't have worked." But it did. And maybe that's the heart of the legend. That in the darkest winter of the war, salvation came not from factories or generals, but from men who refused to die quietly. Men who looked at enemy wreckage and saw hope. If you walk the woods near Bastogne today, you can still find rusted shards of tank armor buried under the moss, bent, fused, and unrecognizable. Some of them belong to German Tigers, some to American Shermans, but they all share the same story. The story of steel reborn, of courage welded in the cold. Frank Donnelly might have vanished into history, but the spirit of his idea didn't. Every modern tank that rolls into battle with layered protection owes a quiet debt to those sleepless welders in the snow. The snow has long melted, but somewhere, under the soil of Belgium, fragments of that German trash remain, mute witnesses to the nights when men turned defeat into defense. This is WW2 Frontline Legends, keeping their story alive. If this tale of courage and ingenuity moved you, please share it, like the video, and subscribe so you never miss another hidden chapter of history. Tell us where you're watching from around the world in the comments below. I read every one. Your hometown might just inspire our next legend. Because somewhere out there, another forgotten hero waits to be found. And their story, like Frank Donnelly's, deserves to be told.